In the winter-black waters of the Atlantic, where storms carved valleys into the sea, and the sky pressed low like a steel lid over a world at war, the United States Navy moved in silence across an ocean that hid more threats than any battlefield on land, a shifting expanse where every shadow could be a submarine's periscope and every false echo could be the beginning of a catastrophe. It was in this tense, metallic quiet that the battleship USS Iowa escorted the most important passenger on Earth, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who traveled not as a statesman on a peaceful voyage, but as the leader of a country fighting for its survival, wrapped in secrecy so overwhelming that even many sailors aboard Iowa did not know who lived behind the armored bulkheads, while destroyers, cruisers, and support ships fanned out in a protective screen, weaving through cold winds at flank speed to guard a single man whose death could alter the trajectory of the war. Among those ships was a destroyer that seemed utterly ordinary at first glance, one of the hundreds of lean, fast, lightly armored vessels that formed the nervous system of the Navy, ships built not for glory but for detection, reaction, and sacrifice. But beneath its steel decks ran a chain of tension that never fully relaxed, a constant hum of worry, training, drills, and exhaustion that grew heavier as the destroyer was assigned to operations near the Iowa, whose mission was so classified that even whispering speculation could cost a man his career. The night fell earlier at that latitude, pressing down on the convoy like a weight, and the moonless sky erased the horizon until sea and air merged into a single black field where no sailor could tell where safety ended and danger began. Radar screens glowed in red and green. Operators tracked phantom signals. Officers paced. Torpedo men checked depth regulators again, and beneath it all lived the unspoken truth that had governed the Atlantic since the first days of the war. The enemy was everywhere even when he was nowhere. On that destroyer, fatigue carved shadows under the eyes of men who had slept in fragments for weeks. Men who understood that a single misread bearing or a delayed order could doom an entire convoy. The captain felt the pressure most of all, because sailing near the battleship carrying Roosevelt meant that any mistake, however small, would be weighed not in naval terms, but in political ones, the kind that shattered careers and rewrote military doctrine. The ocean heaved under the hull, sending vibrations through the bulkheads that mixed with the pulse of the engines, and the wind carried sheets of freezing spray across the deck, soaking watchstanders who refused to blink, because no one wanted to be the man who failed to spot the one real threat hiding among thousands of harmless shadows. The Iowa herself was a mountain of steel, a fortress cutting through the sea at high speed, its gun turrets locked, its radar sweeping the night, its crew aware that the president's life depended on their vigilance. Secret Service agents, out of place in this world of rivets and salt, stood near armored hatches and observed everything with tension, sharpened by responsibility, by the knowledge that the rules of land-based protection meant nothing here, where danger did not come from crowds but from the deep. The convoy stretched out like a ghost fleet, ships visible only as faint silhouettes swallowed repeatedly by waves taller than houses, and communication was kept to the bare minimum, because radio silence was essential when German U-boats lurked beneath the surface, with torpedoes primed for anything large enough to be a battleship. Inside the destroyer, however, radio silence did something else. It multiplied every uncertainty. Orders came through slowly, coded, abrupt, and sometimes ambiguous, because the fog of war existed even without physical fog. It lived in the space between transmissions, in the seconds when an officer had to guess whether a reading was an error or a threat, and these moments fed into a tension that no document could fully capture. The ship's sonar operators, sweating despite the cold, leaned over their consoles, listening to pings that returned distorted echoes, shapes that could have been a whale, a thermal layer, or a submarine cruising silently in the depths, and every uncertain contact forced the crew to imagine the worst. Above them, the night watches scanned the sea through binoculars that revealed almost nothing, their gloves frozen, their breath forming clouds, their bodies numb, but their minds sharpened by fear, because destroyer men knew better than anyone that the ocean did not forgive hesitation. And it was precisely within this tension, this soup of exhaustion, secrecy, bad weather, and the crushing knowledge that the commander-in-chief was less than a mile away, that a chain of misunderstandings began to form, small at first, invisible to any observer, the kind of procedural deviations that seemed harmless until they interacted with other equally small deviations, converging in ways no checklist had imagined. The destroyer altered course slightly to maintain position relative to Iowa. Radar interpreted the movement as more significant than it truly was. A junior officer misread a bearing due to fatigue. The sonar watch misinterpreted a return signal as a possible submerged threat. A coded message arrived late due to atmospheric interference. and each of these details, on any other night, would have produced nothing but mild annoyance and corrective orders. But on this night, carrying this escort mission, with this level of secrecy and pressure, the destroyer's crew felt something else rising beneath their coordinated professionalism, a sense that something was wrong, even if no one could yet articulate what that something was. When the officer of the deck glanced at the radar plot and saw the Iowa's icon shift, he interpreted the drift as a maneuver the battleship had not announced. When the torpedo officer reviewed readiness protocols, he felt the ghost of a threat that sonar had not fully confirmed. When the captain observed how the sea clutter distorted the tactical map, he sensed danger not from the enemy, but from their own formation, from the possibility that misalignment in these seas could produce disaster. Faster than an enemy attack, the destroyer sliced through the darkness, its bow rising and falling with heavy swells, and inside the plotting room men argued in hushed voices about bearings that did not align perfectly, about radar echoes that shifted too quickly, about whether to adjust the ship's position or maintain it. And in this tense atmosphere, where every decision felt like a tightrope walk, the destroyer slowly drifted closer to a point where geometry, timing, fear, and miscommunication were aligning with perfect, catastrophic precision. On the Iowa, meanwhile, Roosevelt slept unaware that the ship guarding him was sliding toward the most embarrassing and dangerous friendly fire incident in United States naval history, unaware that the destroyer's next decisions, taken under extreme pressure, would bring the President of the United States within seconds of death, not from a German torpedo, but from an American one. The ocean moaned under the hulls as if warning what was coming. Wind tore across the decks. Radar operators squinted at screens that grew harder to read. Officers gave short, clipped commands trying to maintain formation in the storm-lashed dark. And then, in a single catastrophic moment, the unthinkable happened. The moment the impossible became real did not begin with noise, but with a silence so sharp it carved itself into the minds of every man on that destroyer, a silence that existed for less than a second, yet felt long enough for fate to slide its hand across the ocean and rearrange the future. In the cramped, sweat-stained nerve center of the ship, where radar operators hunched over flickering screens and the smell of coffee mixed with diesel and human tension, an officer misread a bearing by a margin so small it should have been meaningless, a blip that seemed to move in a pattern consistent with the potential submerged contact, and that error, fed by fatigue, storm clutter, and the relentless psychological pressure of escorting the battleship carrying the president, shaped the next 60 seconds into one of the most disastrous sequences in U.S. naval history. The destroyer's sonar pinged into the abyss, sending sound waves diving through cold black water before returning distorted shapes the operators, conditioned by months of hunting German U-boats, instinctively interpreted as a threat rising from below. Adrenaline surged, voices tightened, officers leaned over the screen, and in that crowded room the terrible transformation began. An escort ship, meant to protect the Iowa, convinced itself that somewhere in the darkness ahead lurked a submarine positioning to kill the commander-in-chief. Electricity moved through the crew like static, sharp and uncontrollable. Torpedo men, already on edge, reached for readiness controls they knew by feel. Junior enlisted sailors glanced at each other with eyes that asked silent questions. Is this real? Are we about to fire? But they kept working because hesitation was not allowed when the possibility, however faint, of a German attack existed. On the bridge, the captain, tired, straining to interpret incomplete information while waves hammered the hull, heard the words no escort commander wanted to hear. Possible submarine contact, bearing drifting toward Iowa's path. It did not matter that the message was uncertain. It did not matter that the reading was inconsistent. The one fact overriding all others was that the President of the United States was aboard the ship ahead, and letting his submarine pass, even a phantom, was unthinkable. Protocol demanded decisive action. The destroyer adjusted course slightly, shaking free from a trough, just as radar showed a shift that looked, under the stress-distorted eyes of the plotting team, like movement consistent with a hostile intercept. What no one aboard realized was that the echo belonged not to a submarine, but to the Iowa herself. The sea state and a glitch in the radar sweep compressed the battleship's return into a profile that looked smaller, faster, and deeper than it truly was. The kind of distortion wartime crews feared precisely because it created illusions far more dangerous than confirmed threats. Still, no one hesitated. In the torpedo room, men worked with the speed of instinct, unlocking safety restraints, checking Euro angles, confirming depth settings, each action carried out on the assumption that a silent enemy prowled nearby. Sweat dripped from foreheads, metal clanked. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the deck plates like a warning heartbeat. And at the worst possible moment, The destroyer rolled hard to port in a steep wave trough, causing the torpedo director to shift a fraction of a degree, just enough to align the preset firing solution with the massive steel hull of the Iowa. No one saw the invisible geometry sliding into place. No one realized that the tiny misalignment meant the firing solution now intersected the president's battleship rather than the Phantom submarine. No one understood how close they were to rewriting American history in an instant. The captain gave the order that would haunt the ship forever. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. 3 torpedoes left their tubes with a violent hiss that shook the hull, each one a steel cylinder of explosive power, each one programmed to run deep, each one slicing into the black water in perfect formation, propellers biting into the sea as they accelerated toward their assigned bearing, straight toward the Iowa. On the battleship, there was no warning at first. The Iowa cut through the waves with cold confidence, unaware that death was rising from behind her, not from an enemy, but from the destroyer tasked with guarding her. Then a lookout shouted the words that should never have needed to exist. Torpedoes in the water. Bearing aft. Chaos erupted instantly across the giant ship. Officers scrambled to verify the report, but there was no time. White trails bubbled behind the Iowa, unmistakably torpedo wakes, and their angle told a truth so horrifying that men hesitated. The attack was coming from their own escort. Secret Service agents burst from their stations, weapons drawn not for combat, but from pure instinct. Sailors sprinted across the deck, shouting bearings, calculating angles, turning voice tubes into a chorus of fear and command. The captain of the Iowa froze for only a fraction of a second before barking the order that became the difference between life and a national catastrophe. Hard right rudder. All engines flank. The battleship shuddered as her massive turbines surged to full power, the deck vibrating under Roosevelt's wheelchair as crewmen rushed him toward armored bulkheads, the ship turning with an agility that belied her enormous size. Behind her, the torpedoes closed the gap, running hot and straight, their Euro compasses locked, their mechanisms deadly in their simplicity. Run forward, strike target, explode with enough force to rip open the hull of even a battleship. On the destroyer, realization struck like a hammer. A young radar operator shouted a correction, too late, and the plotting officer's face drained of color as geometry snapped into clarity. Someone screamed on the bridge, "We fired on Iowa." A sentence that tore through discipline, tearing open the raw human horror beneath the steel professionalism. Panic rippled through the destroyer, men running to confirm the unimaginable, officers shouting contradictory orders, the captain standing stiff, stunned, trying to reconcile the fact that he had just launched 3 torpedoes at the President of the United States. And then came the last humiliation. Protocol demanded the destroyer immediately signal Iowa that the attack was accidental and torpedoes were incoming, but radio silence and encryption protocols turned that warning into a slow-motion disaster of its own. The destroyer sent the message. The Iowa did not receive it. The destroyer sent it again. Interference swallowed it. Only on the 3rd attempt did the battleship finally receive the horrific truth. But by then, the crew did not need a radio message. The torpedoes were already visible, cutting through the black Atlantic like fangs. The wake patterns tightened behind the Iowa as she heeled hard over, water crashing against her armored hull, sailors clinging to rails, gun crews bracing for impact even though their weapons were useless against what approached. Roosevelt, protected deep inside the ship behind armored doors and surrounded by agents gripping their pistols uselessly, felt the ship turn and asked a simple question. What is happening? No one answered. Outside on the destroyer, sailors stood frozen in disbelief, watching their torpedoes, churn toward the most important American ship at sea. A single hit would have torn open Iowa's hull, flooded compartments, killed hundreds, and potentially drowned the president in the cold Atlantic. The ocean held its breath as the first torpedo passed just behind Iowa's stern, missing by a margin so small sailors would later describe it as the width of a whisper. The second torpedo veered slightly off due to turbulence. The third approached like a judgment handed down by fate, straight, unwavering, perfect in its deadly certainty. And then, at the last possible moment, Iowa's desperate evasive turn shifted her enough that the torpedo passed harmlessly into open water, vanishing into the endless dark as though history itself had decided to pause. On both ships, silence followed, not relief, not celebration, but the hollow shock of men who understood how close they had come to killing the President of the United States. The destroyer's captain collapsed into his chair, staring at his hands, the weight of what almost occurred sinking into his bones. Across the ocean surface, tension hung like a fog. And every man who witnessed those torpedoes knew that this incident, this accidental attack on their own commander-in-chief, would carve itself into naval memory forever, because oceans had many tragedies during the war, but only one ship ever fired torpedoes at Franklin Delano Roosevelt and survived to face the consequences. The destroyer that had once seemed merely unlucky now entered the kind of nightmare that would later be recounted in hushed tones among sailors who believed that some ships, like some men, carried a curse stitched into their very rivets. And as the storm clouds thickened across the Pacific sky on that December afternoon, the USS Greerfield carved a trembling path across waters that churned with a restless violence, the horizon painted in that sickly metallic shade sailors knew too well, the color that came before disaster, before machinery struggled, before the ocean reminded every vessel, no matter how modern or well-built, that steel was only steel and could sink like any stone, and the crew moved with a tension that felt welded to their bones as they prepared for the next stage of the escort mission, their thoughts drifting back to every misstep, every malfunction, every near collision that had already earned the ship its infamous reputation. Yet none of those men could imagine how fate would twist further that day, because what was coming for them was not an enemy submarine lurking beneath the waves, nor a Japanese bomber sliding through the clouds, but a convergence of timing, uncertainty, miscommunication, and the terrifying possibility that a single decision, made in fear or instinct, could unleash a catastrophe capable of shaking not just a ship, not just a fleet, but the political heart of the United States itself. For as the Greerfield advanced through roughening waters with its radar sweeping in long, oscillating arcs and its sonar teams listening to the warbling echoes of underwater disturbances, no one on board knew that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, symbol of American resolve, the most guarded man in the wartime world, was approaching their patrol area aboard a separate naval vessel whose presence had been hidden behind layers of secrecy, so thick that even ranking officers escorting him did not know the full movement plan, and the sea, indifferent and vast, placed both vessels on intersecting trajectories that would become the backbone of one of the most unsettling episodes in naval history. Inside the Greerfield's Combat Information Center, light flickered across sweating faces as the radar operator adjusted his set again and again, fighting a persistent interference that made contacts bloom and vanish like ghosts, each phantom blip feeding the sense of unease that had been building since dawn. And the executive officer stood behind him, jaw clenched, as he demanded confirmations that never came, while on deck the gunners checked and rechecked their weapons, the cold metal of the mounts vibrating under their hands as the ship pitched, their minds haunted by stories from earlier that year, stories of how the Greerfield had narrowly avoided shelling one of its own submarines during a confused night exercise, how it had collided with floating debris that tore into its hull like a jagged knife, how it had been struck by friendly depth charges in a training accident that nearly sank it before it ever saw the open Pacific, all of which had given the crew a quiet dread, the unspoken thought that maybe, just maybe, this ship wanted trouble, or attracted it, and even the most level-headed sailors found themselves glancing at shadowed corners as though expecting disaster to emerge from the steel itself. And now, as the wind howled and the waves rose in muscular arcs beneath them, that disaster inched closer in the form of an unidentified surface contact approaching from the east. Steady speed, uncertain course, its signature blurred by the storm until it resembled, to the eyes of every trained radar operator, the exact shape and speed profile of a Japanese auxiliary cruiser known to operate near the Philippines, prompting a tightening in the throat of every man who heard the report, because the Greerfield had standing orders to intercept and challenge any vessel suspected of shadowing American supply lanes, and the captain, exhausted after 36 hours awake, leaned over the chart table with flickering red light outlining the deepening lines on his face as he muttered that the enemy might finally have found them, might finally be making a move against the scattered escorts guarding Roosevelt's broader route, though he did not know Roosevelt was anywhere near, and that thought alone activated the raw instinct in every sailor, that survival depended on action taken. Now, decisively, without hesitation, the destroyer surged forward, engines rumbling like an awakening beast, bow slamming into waves that exploded upward in plumes of white water cascading across the deck and drenching the men, who rushed to battle stations as klaxons wailed, their hearts hammering in sync with the pounding machinery beneath their boots, and orders shot through the corridors with a clipped urgency that electrified the ship, sending men running past bulkheads vibrating under the strain of rising speed, each one bracing for what they believed might be their first real surface engagement, their minds filled not with fear of dying, but with fear of making a mistake, because mistakes haunted this ship like specters, and today would be the worst mistake of them all. Yet no one could see the true identity of the vessel ahead. No one could pierce the veil of rain and churning sea, and the lookout squinted against the stinging spray, unable to confirm silhouette or flag, while the Combat Information Center scrambled to reconcile conflicting reports that suggested the contact might be friendly, then enemy, then friendly again, leaving the captain with a decision that felt like choosing between two abysses. And as the crew loaded the forward guns, with shells glinting under the dim lamps, and as the gunners locked into firing positions, with their hands gripping cold steel, the destroyer's fate bent in the storm's wind, carrying the vessel toward a moment that would later be dissected in hearings, examined by historians, whispered about in naval academies, because when the Greerfield's captain finally issued the order to fire a warning shot, a single 5-inch shell meant to intimidate what he believed to be a Japanese vessel probing for weakness. The shell arced through the storm-dark sky, trailing a glowing tail, spinning toward a target whose identity was still obscured by distance and weather. And for a few horrifying seconds the crew watched the round descend in a bright, curving streak that would change their lives, because only after the shell landed in the water just ahead of the unknown ship did the storm shift, wind tearing aside a curtain of rain that revealed, clear as a nightmare, the silhouette of one of the U.S. Navy's most recognizable escort vessels, a ship assigned to protect none other than President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, and the Greerfield's crew froze in horror as reality snapped into place. The kind of horror that seizes the body with numbing force because they had just fired at FDR's escort. They had just endangered the President of the United States. They had just committed the unthinkable. And the explosion of water from the warning shot's impact still hissed in the air as an awful silence spread across both vessels, a silence so deep it felt like the ocean itself had stopped breathing. And though no damage was done, though no life was lost, the weight of what might have happened crushed the Greerfield's men with a dread greater than any enemy engagement could ever deliver. And as messages flew through encrypted channels, and as the storm thickened once more, swallowing both ships into its roaring gray throat, every man aboard the Greerfield understood that their destroyer had just sealed its place as the most unfortunate ship in U.S. naval history, cursed not by malice, but by a chain of misjudgments and tragic timing that culminated in a moment so implausible, so catastrophic, that even decades later sailors would shake their heads in disbelief at the story of the destroyer that accidentally attacked FDR, and the ocean rolled on beneath them, indifferent, swallowing the moment as quickly as it had created it, even as the consequences echoed far beyond the storm.